So I want to continue that. I want to continue talking about how these same contradictions will continue into the new nation. Right? America gets its independence, and now they have to make a whole series of decisions based on the fact that they're their own country now. Right? They can no longer blame it on Britain. A lot of them are literally blaming slavery on Great Britain. People write and say, we wouldn't even have slavery if it wasn't for King George, right? Which sounds funny because it's really a cop-out, right? So you kind of made us do this. Okay, if that's true then, once they get their independence, they should have abolished slavery right then and there. They do not. It actually gets bigger. At the same time, African Americans, thousands of them, have fought for their freedom, and they're going to take advantage of that. Many of them get their freedom. Some of them may, be harmed by this, as we talked about, but many of them actually get their freedom and are going to do something with it. You might say that they become African Americans at that moment, right? They go from being slaves to being people, free people. Now they're going to have a whole series of complications, as we know, and hard lives in many cases. But if we think about that term African American, maybe this is where it starts, right? Because they actually are able to get citizenship. And what are they going to do with it? We'll see what they do with it, even as people continue to try to oppress them and deal with them. So this new stuff, this kind of new nation era is looking at the African American population, its development, and the continued difficulties. This first slide is an example of the population in 1790. So this is right after the Revolution, right after kind of ratification of the Constitution. Remember last time we talked about how the Constitution itself has all these contradictions in it. Three-fifths compromise. There's a fugitive slave clause in it. Right? All these things are written into the documents. But if you take a snapshot of the nation in 1790, there are some interesting things here. And they're not going to go through all these numbers, but there are some interesting things. This first row is the list of the states. They're not colonies anymore. They're states now. This is the number of slaves in these states in 1790, and this is the number of free blacks. Right? So this is the total black population in these states. Why are there blanks here? Maine, Vermont, and Massachusetts in 1790. How might we read this?
This was the first state to abolish slavery?
Yes, exactly. They've abolished. Remember Massachusetts with Mumford and all them are going to abolish slavery in 1783 or 88, one of them, I forget. So they have 0 slaves as of 1790. And they have 5,369 free blacks, which is a sizable free black population for that time. Look at Virginia in 1790. 292,000 slaves, or almost 300,000 slaves out of a total slave population of 700,000. So most of the enslaved people are in Virginia in 1790. It's almost 300,000. Now there are 12,000, almost 13,000 free blacks. Remember, free blacks have always been here. They've always served as a kind of contradiction to this whole institution of slavery, in fact, if you think of it. Because slavery was all about, well, these folks are inferior, they can't take care of themselves, we have to take care of them, right? They're like children, we must take care of them. But what about those 13,000 folks that were already taking care of themselves? That's why, in some respects, maybe that's why there's such hostility towards free blacks, because they really are this, they want to ignore them, right? They want to move them out of the way, because they disprove all the ideas about black inferiority, right? And they also inspired slaves. If you're working, he's a free black person across the street, you might be like, why can't I be that? I'm running away. I'm going to do it too. It gives them hope in some levels. Yeah. Question?
I want to say, if the blacks were not educated, I mean, they were free, but they didn't come to the level of the whites because maybe they were not educated and didn't have the same rights. Even though they had free.
Yeah, this is one of the problems or one of the hardships or obstacles of being a free black person is, okay, somebody tells you, or say you get your freedom, you buy your freedom. What now? Right? What, you got to find a job. Right? You got to find, usually you would have family members probably that are still enslaved. If you bought yourself, for example, out of freedom, your next goal might be to save some money and buy them, like Renter Smith is trying to do. So you're going to have a whole, it's not like your life gets easy at that point. It's not like you just kick your feet up. In many ways, it got harder in some levels, right? Because you got to find a place to stay. You don't live in slave cabins anymore. And usually, they don't want you anywhere near the slave population to inspire them. You could try to get educated. In some places, there's going to be avenues for that, but in many you're not. You may or may not be able to vote. Right? You may or may not be able to find a job and work with whites. So there are some difficulties there, yet people found ways to do it. They did overcome this. And that's, I always forget that, but this is something I want to reinforce too. We talk a lot about some negative stuff in here. We talk a lot about slavery as an institution. this should not be a depressing conversation because of the fact that there were always people that found ways to survive it, right? Despite the obstacles, they found ways to overcome it and survive and flourish and buy family members out and do all sorts of things, do some amazing things if you really think of it. Some of them, they're early free black millionaires. James Fortin and Paul Cuffey, they were involved in shipping. He had his own shipping line. They were some of the early, wealthy folks. So it was possible. It was just very difficult. And we're going to see how the free blacks are going to try to, claim their freedom. People can't really give you your freedom. You got to take it, and then you have to define it for yourself. What do you do with it, right, when that happens? So this free black population is interesting on a number of levels. You see how few there are compared to the enslaved population, but just the fact that there were any, I think, is significant on some levels. We'll see some of the things that they try to start doing. So when we talk about the demographics, that's a fancy word for population. Right? What is the black population? What does the African American population look like at this moment as the nation itself is born, as the nation is growing and developing? Mid-Atlantic states and New England states, so as opposed to the Deep South, you start to see certain levels of development in the Mid-Atlantic, where we are, essentially, and New England further north, right? Gradually, the abolition laws that you mentioned, right? So you saw how there are a couple of states that don't have slavery, although there is still slavery in the north, right? It's going to last, say, in New York, for example, until 1799. So it still exists early on. It's going to slowly disappear. So it says here, slavery did not end in Delaware until after the Civil War. So in some areas, it's going to persist. But for the most part in the north, it begins to disappear in this period. And in most places, it's going to be gone by about 1820, 1815 in the north. In the south, as we know, it actually increases. New England's ahead of other regions in terms of the abolition. Again, think about Monmouth and others in Massachusetts. Slavery would persist west of the Appalachians, so it is still a national institution at this moment. The African American communities, think about community. All right, these free blacks. What would you have done if you were a free black person? I like to think about that. Say you got your freedom. Right? One impulse might be just to run as far away as you could. Anything that looked like slavery. Right? When you get out of a bad situation, you don't want to sit right next to it. Right? So a lot of folks may have wanted to just leave. Get out of the community and go as far as possible to even forget about being a slave. Yet many do not. And there are going to be some reasons why they do not. One,
they stay and help, like they help other people.
They may stay and feel connected to this imagined community of people that might still be enslaved. Your wife might still be enslaved. Your children might still be enslaved. Cousins, relatives, those that you grew up with. It's the only thing the only area you may have known. So you may just set up a shop, may set up a house somewhere else in the community. And continue to try to do things to help the enslaved population. So this notion of imagined community, I think, is interesting for African Americans, both slave and free, at this particular moment. Some, though, say, you know what, let's get out of here. So as we talked about last time, there is an immigration movement that develops, immigration with an E. This idea that maybe we should leave the United States altogether. Maybe we should go someplace else. Maybe we'll never get freedom and equality here. Right? If you just fought a revolutionary war thinking you're going to be free and equal, all men are created equal, we win the war, Americans win the war, and you still don't have these rights, some folks are like, you know what, take me back to Africa. Some folks are like, maybe I should go to the Caribbean, where all these black people are, right? Or go to Haiti, the first independent black republic, that's going to be founded around the turn of the century. Some say, let's leave. Most, though, do not, right? Most say, you know what, we're as American as anybody else. Some of them are like, look, my grandfather worked here in these same Virginia tobacco fields. Why would I leave now? I've been working for free. My family's been working for free for 200 years. Why shouldn't I stay and benefit from this new nation? But people have a choice to make. African Americans have difficult choices sometimes to make. So what are some of the things that these free blacks are dealing with? Economic discrimination, right? Sometimes they're not hired because of racism. They might not be able to be hired if they're illiterate. If you were a slave, chances are you couldn't read. It was illegal to teach slaves to read unless you snuck and did it, like a Frederick Douglass. So it might be more difficult to get certain type of work for that reason. African Americans will gravitate to East Coast cities. Right? A lot of folks are coming to cities, especially feeling like the North is a place where more freedom might be for them, less racism. Sometimes that's true, sometimes that's not true. Right? A place like Boston, for instance, is going to be the headquarters of sort of the abolitionist movement, but it's also a major area where a number of immigrants, particularly Irish immigrants, are going to come. And a lot of times they don't like black folks that much. There still is the stereotype of Boston that black folks aren't welcome there. So it's interesting to think about how the North and some of these cities may have provided hope for African Americans, but sometimes that hope gets shattered pretty quickly. Again, this is also a time of white migration. Whites are moving around the nation. Immigrants are coming into the United States. So the United States is changing. The face of these cities is going to be changing dramatically. And job opportunities may vary from place to place. People talk about Baltimore, for example, is a good place to go. You get a job on the docks. People like Frederick Douglass, for example, have a history of working on the docks and maybe being able to get work there more readily than you might in some other places before heading north. Even in Boston, blacks are compressed to the lowest economic ranks. So you could probably get a job, but it might be a low-paying, dirty, dangerous job. But it's better than slavery, right? And it allows you maybe to make at least a little bit of money and take care of yourself. So it's at least some opportunity. Black migration to Boston, again, is this idea of the North, this idea of Boston in particular as a center for abolition. You want to go where folks are fighting against slavery if you're a former slave. So you might want to go to a place like Boston where William Lloyd Garrison, the famous white abolitionist, is headquartered, and others, right? Early abolition in Massachusetts will spur black migration. You heard about Mumbet and other folks that helped to abolish slavery there in the 1780s, so you want to go there. Maybe this is the land of freedom, if not Virginia, if not the South. Philadelphia, there's an early rise in the black community there. And this is attributed to the fact that Pennsylvania is the first state to pass an emancipation law. Pennsylvania, Philadelphia in particular, right? City of brotherly love. You'll see in the video I want to show you here in a second some discussion of Philadelphia. And, the idea of freedom, the idea of equality sometimes was even stronger than the kind of reality of racism. You think it's going to be a better place to live, so why not give it a try? And thousands of blacks may go there, which then makes for a stronger black community. It's better to be among people that look like you, think like you, and are concerned about some of the same things that you're concerned about. Black urban institutions, like the church, for example, will develop in places like Philadelphia. We'll see some examples of that. Although the majority of jobs there are going to remain unskilled, lower-paying jobs. New York City is another place, right? There's always been a large black population in New York, as we've kind of seen, but particularly, the city area, the New York sort of urban area, there may be some opportunities there as well. Slavery, again, is legal in New York until 1799. They would actually have gradual abolition laws, so they had things like, you'll be freed at age 25. So Sojourner Truth, the famous abolitionist and women's rights activist, was a slave in New York, but she's going to live through freedom there and emancipation there. So until then, the black community in New York would remain heavily enslaved, but the free population is growing larger and larger. More and more people are finding access to freedom. Some as a result of the Revolutionary War, some as a result of maybe some of the feelings coming out of that era. Some, whites recognize the contradictions of fighting a war for freedom and equality and yet holding people enslaved. So more and more people are finding avenues or pathways to freedom. So some that come from the rural areas and go to these cities, they need jobs, right? Occupations, work is one of the first things that they're going to be looking for. Community institutions. How do you make yourself feel more human? Well, get around people like you. Find a church. It's still one of the main areas that people kind of get acclimated to new cities, right? If you move right now to Los Angeles, California, one of the first things you probably want to do is find you a church. The church is going to be this religious institution for a largely religious population, but it also provides a number of social things. You need to know where the stores are. You need to know where some folks can help you out finding a job, maybe, right? Maybe it's going to be in the church. And the black church has always been a really important social institution as well as a religious institution. So you'll see how often the church is mentioned in the chapter and in some of these videos and things. So it emerges as a result of blacks' desire to participate in shared cultural traditions. Think, imagine community. You don't want to be by yourself all the time, right? You want to be able to share your experiences and culture among other people that may look like you or think like you or be concerned about some of the same things that you're concerned about. Independent black churches. Independent black churches will spring up and be founded both in the North and the South. This came up a bit when we talked about the first Great Awakening in the 1730s. This was a national movement where people are starting to try to question what God wants them to do. A lot of people come back to religion in that period before the war. There's going to be a second Great Awakening right around this time where folks, again, are questioning what is it God wants. These are white folks and black folks that are kind of questioning this kind of national religious revival, sometimes attracting thousands of people. You go outside to hear one of these famous preachers, and there could be black and white people together, which itself was rare, worshiping God and listening to this person. It attracts blacks to evangelical, anti-slavery Methodists and Baptists. You might really be drawn to a church that's also vocally against slavery. Like some churches, not all religious people were against slavery, but some were. So if you're African American, you might very well be drawn to one of these denominations or one of these churches where they preach against slavery. There's a couple spots there. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones are two black men that are going to be prominent in founding black churches, some of the earliest black churches of this period. And there are going to be reasons why they feel the need to do that, right? Some of it has to do with discrimination in churches. Religious people were not anti-racist all the time. Sometimes they could be both Christian and very racist. Founders of the Free African Free Society, right? They decided to break away from St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church after they're told they have to sit in the balcony. They've been worshiping at this church, and suddenly they said, you know what? They're told, black folks got to sit over there. You got to sit separate. We can all worship God, but you got to be separate. Think about that. We're all coming to worship the same God, right? Now suddenly we're segregated. So you have a choice to make. Do you sort of take that and say, okay, let's just go sit here, or do you say, no, that's not right? Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, and others are going to resist this. And ultimately found their own churches. They walk out. They say this is not what God wants. So you get the first African Methodist Episcopal Church. You hear of the AME Church, still in existence, still very important to this day, and the AME, Zion's another branch. So the Methodist General Council would attempt to control Richard Allen's new church. Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision will lead the way for this first black-led denomination. Maybe we can think about this as black nationalism. Remember, black nationalists are saying we need to be in control of our own institutions. Even think about later, like a Malcolm X, right? Control your community. Have black teachers in black schools, black police officers in black communities. This is 100 years, 150 years before that, but they have black ministers. They have their own church because the mainstream church is not doing what they need. And so this is really sort of early black nationalism in a form, if you think about it. AME Church will grow, and it's going to spread out. It starts in Philadelphia and one in South Carolina, for example, in the Baptist church there, but it's going to spread to other cities, Pittsburgh, Charleston. Separate black institutions. If you're not getting what you need from the mainstream churches, if white Christians are not treating you fairly, maybe you do for yourself, found your own. So some free blacks say, okay, we're going to be Americans, but we'll just be separate. If we have to be separate, let's do it for ourselves. Let's do everything we need for ourselves and be independent in that sense. Be independent. Maybe that's the definition of freedom, is independence. Doing for yourself, not relying on someone else who can then tell you what to do. If somebody's giving you money, they have the right to tell you what to do with that money. If you're making your own money, then you do what you want. This is something we definitely understand. Community associations and institutions will help to create an urban black leadership class. So Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, as ministers, suddenly become leaders. They're people, individuals that blacks look up to for leadership, for guidance. What do they think about the issues of the day? You're creating a leadership class. And it's not surprising, perhaps, that it may begin in churches. Think about the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. These guys are ministers. There's many, many, many ministers who end up being political activists because, in part, the community was already looking up to them as leaders. They're sort of natural leaders, if you think about it, because they're independent. Boston School Committee's 1812 decision to subsidize black schools is the root of Boston's segregated school system. So education. Maybe you need to start your own schools if black children aren't going to be allowed to learn with white children. What do? Do you just leave them uneducated? Like you were asking earlier about education. They start their own schools. This question of white philanthropy. Now, this is an interesting and important question. Again, I don't ever want you to be simplistic in your thinking. It's too simple and it's incorrect to think that all white people were bad or that they're bad today and that all black people were good, that they were all on your side. That's just wrong, first of all. I can give you a couple of examples. Number one, the three major slave revolts in this country, right? Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, and others, really any slave revolts. Most slave revolts failed and were discovered before they started because somebody told on them. Like Denmark Vesey and Gabriel Prosser, they had to worry about the people that, like, we're going to revolt tomorrow this time. All of a sudden, somebody shows up, you get locked up. What happened? Somebody told, right? Somebody black told. So to think simplistically that all black folks are on your side, there were some folks, I'm going to tell on you. That's going to help me in my situation. Right? Can't think about race in that simplistic a way. Now, there are whites also in this period that definitely were willing to help African Americans. Most whites probably were not, but there are many that are. William Lloyd Garrison, again, is a good example that you'll read about. He's this white guy, incredibly radical abolitionist. He starts his newspaper in Boston in the 1830s, and he's saying, you know what? The revolution is a contradiction. He says the Constitution is a contradiction. He burns copies of it publicly. Says this is a deal with the devil, lights it on fire. This is the white guy. Elijah Lovejoy, white abolitionist, literally gets killed for some of his radical views because he's willing to help African Americans try to end slavery. So again, we got to be careful with just sort of simplistic views of black and white. Yet at the same time, free blacks had some decisions to make about white philanthropy. What about those that were willing to help or contribute money, say, but what if control comes with that money? Or what if you write a check and say, I'm going to help you start a church? Oh, thank you, that's great. It will really help us. We're free black, we're just starting out, but thanks for the check, $1,000, cool, let's put that in. But then they say, oh, you know what? I don't want you preaching that radical stuff. Right? I don't want you preaching that revolt stuff or liberty by any means, or I want you to focus on those one verses, slaves obey your master's verse. How about that? Right? All of a sudden you're like, wait, no, your money is cool, but you're not going to tell me what to do. Right? You're not going to control me. So this question of philanthropy always involved other questions, right? These folks wanted to be independent. Can you be independent and still dependent on outside help? This is going to be an ongoing question for African American communities. Or do you have to do it yourself? Should you just pass the hat in the church, even if you don't make enough money that comes from within and you don't have to answer to anybody else? Some folks are going to go that route. Some folks are going to realize, especially early on, that they need white allies. So this question of philanthropy is important, but it also helps, especially early on, in terms of building and founding many of these institutions. Again, it might lead to some conflicts, especially over leadership and control. Politics. Disfranchisement, that's a fancy word. The franchise is a word that means voting, basically, the right to vote. So anytime you see disfranchisement or disenfranchisement, that means taking away the right to vote. So if you ever see franchise or suffrage, there are a number of words that we don't use as much now, but they just basically meant the right to vote. So disfranchisement of blacks, taking away the right to vote of these free blacks. Many state legislatures will open up voting for white men in the new nation. They're really expanding democracy for white men, but sometimes they do that at the expense of African Americans. So for example here, they open up voting for white men by abolishing property restrictions. Early on, there were rules in place that said things like, okay, yeah, anybody that owns 1,000 acres can vote. What that does is it eliminates African Americans. It definitely eliminates slaves that didn't own property, right? It eliminates most free blacks that probably only had a little bit of property. It also eliminated most whites. Most whites wouldn't have that 1,000 acres. Most poor whites, small farmers, they would have been eliminated by that. Now, those 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention that we talked about last time, the wealthiest of the wealthy, they're like, oh, that's cool. We got 1,000 acres. So slowly they start to get rid of property restrictions to open it up. So early on, maybe say 25% of the American population might have been able to vote. They would have been male, they would have been wealthy, they would have been white. If you get rid of property restrictions, it might mean that half the American population now can vote. They're still going to be male, but they don't have to be as wealthy, right? And it may, it's going to be used against free blacks. Who's missing from this? Women. Women can't vote, no matter how much property she had. And it's also more difficult for these women to hold on to their property because of issues of gender. So we'll focus on gender quite a bit in this new nation as well as race. But many of the statutes will disfranchise black men. So they open up voting for white men, more and more white men than ever before, by taking it away from blacks, particularly black men. Free black property holders will find it increasingly more difficult to vote. And the black vote is an issue because now you have more and more free blacks. So the political parties are starting to pay attention to them. Right? They either want to recruit them, vote for us, or they want to make sure they can't vote if they don't think they're going to vote for them. So the Federalists, we mentioned last time, the Federalists, remember those are the ones that are in favor of the Constitution, in favor of sort of government power. Early on, the Federalists are more likely to oppose slavery. That might mean that black people say, well, we want to vote for them. Right? They're more likely to oppose slavery than the anti-Federalists or the Democratic Republicans, as they're called later. So this means that more blacks might look towards that political party. Haitian Revolution figures into American politics. After a long struggle, Haiti becomes the first black republic. Haiti was a slave colony. Santo Domingo was a colony of the French. Their most important, their most valuable sugar plantation, essentially, a whole island. You got 100,000 slaves or so producing sugar that benefited only France. They hear about this American Revolution. Haiti is close. Haiti was 100 miles away from Florida. They heard all these messages about all men are created equal and we don't want to have a king anymore in this country. We're Americans, we're independent. They said, that stuff sounds kind of good. They embrace those ideals themselves. And they're going to say, you know what? Patrick Henry said, give me liberty or give me death. They say, that's a good idea. They would revolt. They would defeat the French. And they say, we're changing the name of the island. We're going to name it Haiti. We're independent. They set up the second independent republic in the Western Hemisphere, second only to the United States. Now, you would think that the U.S. would be like, wow, that's fantastic, right? They've grasped, they've embraced these ideals that we put out there in our revolution, and they're a brother or sister nation to us. Do you think that's what happened? No, it's not going to happen because what's the difference? It's a black nation. It's a nation of former slaves. They're seen as particularly dangerous for the U.S., which is a slaveholding society. What if all the slaves in South Carolina, Virginia, hear about this and say, hey, we like that. Let's do that too, right? Let's rise up and kill our masters. Right? So the U.S. is going to do everything it can to hinder Haiti's development. They do not recognize their government, for example. Some people say that's where Haiti's problems really begin. Haiti is still a very poor country. It's had a lot of issues in its history, political and otherwise, economic. Considered one of the poorest nations in the world. But some of that may have started with the fact that, look how it started. Had all the nations of Europe shutting it down. The U.S. shutting it down. The people that would have been in the best position to help shut them down. So maybe it has something to do with at least the start. We can't blame everything on that, perhaps, but at least the beginning of it. It shows again this contradiction. It wasn't about all men are created equal. At least if you looked at issues of race. The Federalists tended to support their revolution. The Democratic Republicans, Jefferson and others, were against that revolution. This is a picture of Toussaint Louverture, who is going to be seen as one of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution. Former slave, helps lead the revolution historically. Eventually, he's going to be sort of tricked, and he goes to France to kind of meet with French leadership, and he's going to be imprisoned and die there. But the revolution itself will survive and live on, and the nation is going to be born. Toussaint is this important figure in in this. Kind of the Haitian George Washington, or the Haitian, Thomas Jefferson, if you think of it that way. Louisiana Purchase. Louisiana Purchase happens in 1803. Right, in 1803, this is going to be particularly important. This comes up in the video, so I don't feel like I need to say too much about it right now. But I want you to think about its significance in regards to slavery. Think about its significance in regards to slavery. There is a moment in American history where, and really right around this revolution, where we think that slavery might be on its way out. We think it might be on its way out. Economically, there are some indicators that its productivity might be going down. Maybe it's not worth it, right? If these folks are going to revolt and kill everybody up, we might want to really think about freeing them, right? Remember, they debate during the whole Constitutional Convention, they debate whether or not to stop the slave trade. In part because, do you want to keep bringing in all these rebellious Africans? There's a fear of these Africans. They come in here, they're kind of wild. Right? They keep going ham on folks. I don't know if you like this. Look at what's just happened in Haiti. Do you want that to happen in Virginia? A lot of folks are very concerned about this. Some of them are understanding that the contradictions here are too much. Like, how are you going to fight a war saying all men are created equal and then hold people and go home to your slaves? Some folks are like, that just, come on, that don't make sense. But they do continue slavery, right? They're going to continue it. And two things happen really sort of early in this new nation that kind of ensure that slavery will continue. One of them is going to be the invention of the cotton gin. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 changes the game economically. This is a machine that's created cotton. It's kind of this crop that's going to take over for tobacco as the most important crop coming out of the U.S. It's going to make the South wealthy. It's going to make the nation wealthy. But it's difficult. I've never picked cotton myself, but I've heard stories about how difficult it is getting the cotton out. You got to do it by hand. It's very difficult, right? And it's not that productive. It might take a slave all day to pick 3 pounds of cotton. Right? And so some people are like, is it worth it? But what happens is this cotton gin is going to be invented in 1793 that can, it's a machine where you put the stuff in it and it separates it for you. It makes cotton production much more productive. One historian in the video said that now, all of a sudden, one slave can clean 50 times as much cotton with the cotton gin than he or she could without it. So this is like a lottery ticket. You can plant much more cotton, you can grow much more cotton, you can harvest much more cotton. All of a sudden, the nation is like, wow, it's like crack. It's going to make the nation wealthy overnight, 1793. Well, some folks say, well, that's great, but we still don't really, you're going to run out of land. Some of the land is not productive. Maybe there's still a chance of getting rid of slavery in this period. Louisiana Purchase is going to change that in 1803. Thomas Jefferson, President Jefferson, has sent representatives to France to negotiate to purchase the port of New Orleans. He was prepared to pay $14-15 million to buy the port of New Orleans by itself. It was an important location. It was kind of at the mouth of the Mississippi. It would have been good for trade to control that port, right? He sends these representatives to Napoleon in France, and France is dealing with its own issues that we just talked about. France is losing Haiti, its most valuable, profitable slave colony. Now, Napoleon, the French leader, his plan is really, he wants to conquer the world. He was one of those that he wanted the French flag to fly around the world. But now he loses his most important slave colony, his sort of gateway into the new world. He is suddenly willing to make a deal. So Jefferson sent these representatives to France to buy just the port of New Orleans. All of a sudden, he's presented with an opportunity. Napoleon says, I'll sell you the whole Louisiana territory for that $14-15 million. Same price, but not just the port, not just New Orleans, this massive piece of land. This purchase will double the size of the United States in 1803, just by writing a check. Double the size of the U.S. So now all of a sudden you have this new machine to produce more cotton than ever before, and you got all this new land within a 10-year period in 1803. It's going to lead to an economic explosion. It's going to lead to the tremendous growth of slavery, because slaves were the ones picking the cotton. So the Louisiana Purchase is really a major tipping point in American history, and it's also a major tipping point in African American history. If there was an opportunity, if there was a moment to get rid of slavery, it's gone. With this purchase, it's going to be gone. So keep this in mind as you'll see some of this here in a second. Free black voters preferred Federalists, like we said, because of their prominence in early anti-slavery societies. Even though not all Federalists were critical of slavery, there are Northern Federalists in places like New York. There were also some Southern Federalists. That was their kind of political association, but they owned slaves. The party's northern base would continue to grow, especially in cities. They saw themselves more as representative of the urban areas. The Democratic Republican Party saw themselves, like Jefferson, as more of a representative of small farmers. So you're already seeing some differences among the political parties. Contentious elections, we don't even necessarily go into all of that, as long as you understand there's tension between these parties. And it's going to impact African Americans. Black writing and art. Blacks would adopt various literary forms to define their position in relation to the dominant white society. So culture, black culture is important, right? Painting, writing stories, writing slave narratives, poetry, right? Phyllis Wheatley, for example. We've already thought about how this cultural production is also very political. Many are going to choose to voice their opinions through culture. It's going to link African American communities with others of African descent in the Atlantic world. So, for example, say a painter in South Carolina paints a fabulous picture of Toussaint Louverture as a hero in Haiti. Imagine a community there, right? They both might be black, right? They're both black, but they're not both African American in that same sense. But it's a connection that you might see among the arts here, emphasizing sort of black accomplishment and positive things rather than the sort of negative stereotypes that were the norm. Pamphlets. A number of folks write pamphlets, anti-slavery pamphlets, for example, pamphlets for racial equality. Usually they were published orations, so you had a minister, for example, that would get a famous speech and would publish it so that it gets a wider, or David Walker's appeal. He writes this and it gets spread all throughout the nation, throughout the world. Countered racist depictions of blacks in the dominant society. We'll talk more about that, how folks are going to try to counter the negative images of African American men and women in this period and afterwards. Some will commemorate the end of the slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade is officially closed by the U.S. January 1, 1808. So they stopped. It's illegal, I should say. It's illegal to bring in Africans from outside the U.S. as of 1808. Is that going to end slavery? No. It's going to change it, because we're going to see really more of a domestic slave trade that we'll talk about, moving people around within the U.S. since you couldn't bring them from outside the U.S., trying to find other ways to increase the slave population. What might be some other ways to increase the population? What might you guess? Because it's not like slavery ends. In fact, it increases. How might you maintain your slave population and even increase it if you're not allowed to bring in new slaves from the outside?
Might you capture the free blacks?
Capture and kidnap free blacks. If you've seen 12 Years a Slave, right? He's living in New York, chilling, right? He goes out drinking with some buddies, wakes up in a slave house. Solomon Northrop. He ends up here, not far from here in D.C., and ends up a slave for 12 years. So you might kidnap free blacks, right? Free blacks are always in a precarious position. Their freedom is always at risk. That's one way. How else? How else do you think you might increase the population of slaves? What else might be? How do you work with those numbers? How do you do it without bringing in more from the outside legally? Some are still going to be smuggled in from the outside. They'll act like the ship is full of rum, but they'll sneak in at night and do, like a drug trade, basically.
Yeah.
So that does still happen, but it did increase or decrease the numbers, I should say, since it's illegal. How else might you increase the numbers? What is another way to produce more slaves? You know at least one more answer to this, based on stuff we've studied before.
They produce more children.
Black women, right? There are things like slave breeding. Like you got a slave, you got a real big dude, a big old buck, right? You look healthy. You look like, let's get married. She look like she got them hips. Let's put them together, right? Well, Mary's like, nah, I'm cool. He's not really my type. Mary's like, nah, I like dreadlocks. I like locks. He got like a fade. I'm not feeling him. Mary gets beaten. How you feeling now, Mary? Oh, he looks a little better now, right? Put him in there, and this often happens. And the dude might be the same. She's tall. I don't like her, right? Didn't matter what you liked. This was slave breeding. You were the property of someone else. They put them in and say, you know what, you might want to have a child by this time next year. If you don't, I think I might have to sell you. You're not valuable to me. So, slave breeding. Or, we know the other side of that too. What happens if masters took it upon themselves to impregnate a woman? Child's a slave. So again, this notion of natural reproduction sometimes wasn't so natural, but it does lead to increase. There are 700,000 African Americans in 1790. There are 4.5 million in 1860. So in those 90 years, there is an increase. Now, some of it is natural increase. People that are human beings want to get married and reproduce and these sorts of things. That's some of it, but there are also some very unnatural things that happen, and we'll talk about that. There's also some resistance that may come from this that we'll talk about. Men that are going to resist and say, women that are going to resist. I'll tell you some good examples of some women that are like, nah, not going to happen. Celia in Missouri. Master comes around like, yeah, I want to do something. She's like, no, we're not going to do that. Yeah, we are. Celia kills him, cuts him up in little pieces, puts him in the fireplace.
She killed her master?
He didn't rape nobody else. She's going to get killed, but he didn't rape anybody else.
Did she get killed?
Yeah, she made that choice. She said it's not going to happen. And we'll see different forms of resistance there, right? We'll talk more about that, especially after 1800, when it's more. There's one other way too that you get not necessarily more slaves, but slaves where you needed them. So, for example, after 1830 in Virginia, most of the land, because of tobacco and other things, is worn out. You actually have less production here. So you got what's called the domestic slave trade. Masters move south. When you get Texas, for example, a lot of folks move from Virginia down south to Texas. They take their slaves with them, or they just sell them south. When we had 1,000 slaves, we only need about 200. Let's get rid of 800 of them. We'll get some money out of it, and So for them, it was just an economic decision. But of course, for African Americans, it's going to be, you just sold my sister, right? So these economic decisions have a variety of significances for African Americans as well. Again, we'll see a lot of this play out here. Talked about Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. They would write a pamphlet as well. The first blacks to receive a copyright for a pamphlet to defend black communities' behavior during the 1793 yellow fever epidemic. We'll see that here in a second. African Americans are challenged when this epidemic breaks out in Philadelphia and some other places. African Americans are called on to help. Pamphleteers will attempt to replace negative racial images with group images of respectability. So you paint a picture of a positive black family. That seems like it's not very significant, but it is significant if all the public's images are that blacks are savages, right? Or that fathers are not present, that mothers don't care about their children. Right? You painting that picture, it could be very significant. So we'll see how culture kind of plays out here. The spiritual autobiography, we talked about Equiano before, his narrative, Jupiter Hammond, others, painters, Joshua Johnston is an early painter, Benjamin Banneker. These figures that really disproved ideas of black inferiority. Benjamin Banneker is a great example. Most accomplished black man of letters. He would issue almanacs. He is appointed to lay out the streets of Washington, D.C. Jefferson and others recognize that this dude is so talented, he's going to lay out the streets. So again, think about how that contradicts notions of black inferiority from the beginning. We'll need to get into the War of 1812 now. Essentially what's going to happen is the United States fights another war against Great Britain in 1812, and nobody really wins. It's kind of a draw. But again, African Americans have to decide which side they're going to fight on. And many are going to fight and defend their new nation, the United States. U.S. wins, and this is obviously going to impact African Americans in certain ways. Okay, that was kind of a lot of information, but I wanted to lay that out, particularly around this notion of the new nation, what's happening in the new nation, and why is it important. In the Week 10 folder is the third part of the Africans in America video. It picks up right with this new nation, particularly 1793 and the yellow fever epidemic and what's going on in Philadelphia and some other places. So I'm the time we have, I'm going to play a little bit of this so you can kind of see what these new black communities, particularly free black communities, are up to. What are they doing?
Your favorite fish.
And how are they being treated, right? How are they responding to the conditions in front of them? Some of which are particularly harsh and difficult, but how are they going to feed themselves? Employment. How are they going to educate themselves and their children? How are they going to found their own churches and institutions?
Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and Philip.
About 15 minutes of this and then I'll stop. Yeah, this is part 3 of the same series, but it picks up in 1793. Right? The revolution is now over, and you're seeing the challenges of freedom. Alright, tired of this music. This is the way they open each of these episodes. But you'll see some characters that are already introduced that are still important here too. Like Venture Smith lives until 1805. David Walker comes up in this section as well, even though you already saw him in the other video.
Many may write fictions portraying lowly life as it is, or as it is not. May expatiate with owlish gravity upon the bliss of ignorance, discourse flippantly from armchairs of the pleasures of slave life. But let them toil with him in the field, sleep with him in the cabin, feed with him on husks. Let them behold him scourged, hunted, trampled on, and they will come back with another story in their mouths. Let them know the heart of the poor slave. Learn his secret thoughts, thoughts he dare not utter in the hearing of the white man. Let them sit by him in the silent watches of the night. Converse with him in trustful confidence of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they will find that 99 out of every 100 are intelligent enough to understand their situation and to cherish in their bosoms the love of freedom as passionately as themselves. Solomon Northrop, 12 years a slave.
In January 1793, a remarkable sight appeared above the rooftops of Philadelphia, the birthplace of American independence. A woven basket large